She came chasing a man who vanished without a trace. What she found instead was the truth no one dared to speak. Before we dive in, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and hit the subscribe button. The wind came first, sharp and sudden across the plains, whistling through the dead branches and tugging at the last weak leaves, clinging to the cottonwoods. But Beckett Harper didn't look up from his saddle straps until his horse gave a nervous huff. Then came the thunder, rolling heavy behind the hills, not from the sky, but from hooves strange ones. Not his own, not from the barn. He stepped out onto the porch, wiping grit from his eyes just in time to see a figure riding through the dusk. The horse lathered and panicked. The rider slumped, but clutching the reins like they were her only lifeline. The white of her dress was the first thing that struck him. It caught the last bit of light like a ghost cresting the ridge, and then he saw the crimson, a smear at the hem like a wound dragged across the prairie. She didn't speak when she arrived, didn't look up, just slid from the saddle and hit the dirt like her body had given up. Beckett moved fast, boots thudding against the steps, and when he turned her over, her eyes were wide open but hollow, lips pressed together like they'd been sealed by something deeper than pain. "Ma'am?" he said, but she only stared past him. Her skin was cold, her hands trembled. She smelled of rain and dust, and something sour underneath fear, maybe, or hunger, or the ache of too many miles. He scooped her up, light as a breath, and carried her inside, laying her down by the hearth just as the rain began in earnest, drumming the roof like fingers, tapping warnings. She didn't protest, didn't flinch, just pulled her arms close to her chest like she was afraid someone might take them. "You're safe here," Beckett said, crouching beside her. "Storm'll pass. You can rest." She blinked once, slow and distant, but her lips never moved. He brought her a blanket, some water, and lit the fire. Her dress was soaked through, the blood at the hem dried now but unmistakable. Not hers, he realized. There was no wound he could see, but the blood was there, and she hadn't ridden from nowhere. Beckett sat in the old rocking chair across from her, watching her like a man watches a sleeping dog he's not sure will bite when it wakes. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what happened. The silence wrapped the cabin tighter than the storm. When she finally stirred, hours later, it was to sit up and clutch a small satchel to her chest with a kind of desperation he hadn't seen since the war. She caught him watching, and for a second something flickered across her face: recognition, fear, something he couldn't name, but it vanished just as fast. "You're hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Chased!" Another slow shake. "Bride?" Her fingers tightened around the satchel. That was all the answer he needed. Beckett looked away then, jaw tight. The only thing more dangerous than a mail-order bride showing up unannounced in a wedding dress was one who refused to speak. She could be running from a husband, from the law, from worse, but she'd ridden hard. She'd bled, or someone had bled for her to get here. And she'd chosen his land, his cabin. That wasn't luck. That was need. He stood and tossed another log on the fire, the crackle sharp in the quiet. "Name's Beckett Harper," he said finally, voice low. "You don't gotta say yours yet. But I figure, if you're staying the night, you should know who you're with." She didn't respond, just stared into the flames like they could burn away whatever ghost was riding her shoulders. He left her then, moved to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. But sleep wouldn't come. Not with her sitting there. Not with her silence filling every corner. She didn't belong here. And yet neither did he, really. The cabin had always been too quiet since his brother passed. Too empty since the war took the rest. Maybe silence just knew how to find its kin. The storm deepened outside, wind howling like a coyote caught in barbed wire, and Beckett watched the woman rock slightly in place, fingers never leaving that satchel. There were words trapped inside her, he knew it. Words and wounds, the kind that don't bleed out loud. But he also knew something else. A woman like that doesn't ride alone through a storm unless she's got nowhere left to go. And a wedding dress with blood on the hem is more warning than welcome. Beckett didn't sleep that night. Not really. Not the kind of sleep that takes you and leaves you rested. He dozed with his boots still on, rifle leaning against the hearth, one eye half open toward the silhouette of the girl, curled beneath his wool blanket. The fire cracked low and mean, The storm outside still muttering like an old drunk refusing to go home, but inside the cabin was tight with stillness, a kind of breathless waiting, like even the shadows were holding their tongues. She hadn't moved much since he laid her there. Once, he thought he saw her lift the satchel and pull it under her chin like a child might with a favorite doll. And another time, he heard what sounded like a whimper, not pain, not even fear, but something older, something hollowed out. He sat up when the rain began to fade and the wind started dragging dawn in behind it, light coming in, bruised through the warped panes, touching her face just enough to show the dirt beneath her lashes and the red mark across her cheekbone. Not fresh, maybe 2 days old, maybe from a hand. He stood and stretched the stiffness out of his legs, boots thudding soft on the old wood, and walked to the window to check for tracks. None he didn't recognize. No riders, no one trailing her. Not yet. When he turned back, she was watching him, eyes open wide and fixed on him like they'd been for hours. "Mornin'," he said, quiet. Her gaze didn't blink. He tried again. "You sleep any?" Nothing. Not even a twitch. Just those eyes, gray or blue, he still couldn't tell, digging into him like they were trying to remember something they hadn't seen yet. He grabbed a tin of beans and set them on the stove, pouring water into the kettle with one hand, trying not to look like he was watching her from the corner of his eye. She sat up slow, careful not to make a sound, and adjusted the satchel against her side. Her fingers were raw around the knuckles, dirt under the nails, blood near one cuticle. "You hungry?" Beckett asked, pointing at the stove. Still nothing. He figured maybe she couldn't speak. Maybe whatever she'd been through had cracked her voice too deep to use. Or maybe she just didn't want to. But when he set the plate down in front of her and stepped back, she looked at it, looked at him, and reached for the fork like it weighed more than her hand. She ate small, slow, like she was afraid someone would snatch it away, and when she finished, she wiped her mouth with the corner of her sleeve and slid the plate back without looking at him. That was when he saw the bundle tucked beside the satchel. Paper, envelopes, maybe, folded letters tied with twine. He squinted but didn't move. Not yet. She must have caught his stare, because she gripped them tighter and turned her body away from him, shoulders stiff as fence posts. He stepped back and sat down again, heart ticking like a rusted clock. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said after a long while. "But I reckon I should tell you this ain't a place most folks come to by mistake. So if you're hiding from someone, you got a head start." Still no answer. He rubbed his jaw, the bristle rasping under his palm, and leaned forward. "Thing is, I've seen enough to know what silence like yours means. And if someone hurt you..." Her head snapped up. It was so fast he froze. Not in fear, in recognition. The look in her eye wasn't pleading. It was warning. Not to finish that sentence. Not to assume. Not to poke a wound he hadn't earned the right to touch. He held up both hands. "All right. Fair." She stared at him another beat, then looked down at the letters and pulled them closer like they were the only proof of something she couldn't say out loud. Beckett stood slowly. "You'll be safe here today. Weather should keep most riders off the trail. I got chores to see to. If you want more food, help yourself." She didn't nod, didn't blink, just went still again. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, but his thoughts stayed back in the cabin, circling her like a dog trying to find a place to lie down. Something was off, more than just the silence. Those letters hadn't been opened, not a single seal broken, and the way she held them tight, like they were fragile but dangerous, told him they weren't hers. Or maybe they were meant for someone else. Someone who hadn't read them, someone she'd traveled to find. Beckett turned toward the barn and tried to shove the thoughts down, tried to let the wind scrape them off like it always did, but they stuck. Clung. That blood on her hem had dried into the threads, and that kind of stain never washes out easy. Not from fabric, not from memory, not from the hands that touched it. The sun broke through the storm like it didn't care what the night had done, sending hard gold light across the frost-bitten dirt and up the sides of Beckett's old barn, where the wind had already peeled half the shingles. He worked with rhythm, pitchfork clearing out soiled straw, boots thudding like a metronome against the worn boards. But his mind wasn't on the hay. It was in the cabin, wrapped in wool and silence, curled around that satchel like a secret. She hadn't said a word, not once, but something about her silence kept unfolding in his head, like a riddle written without ink. When the chores were done and the sky began to bleach toward noon, he walked back toward the cabin with a bucket of water in one hand and a bag of oats in the other, pretending it was just another day. But nothing about the air felt like normal. He stepped inside slow, soft, boots knocking twice against the threshold before he looked up and froze. She wasn't on the cot. She was standing at the bookshelf, the bundle of letters held loosely in one hand, her other hand tracing the spine of a book she wasn't reading. She didn't flinch when he entered, didn't even turn. She just lowered the letters, opened the top flap of her satchel, and slipped them inside like tucking away a blade. "Hope you're not allergic to oats," Beckett said, setting the bucket down by the stove. "It's not steak, but it's warm." She turned then, slow, like the world had to pass through her before she gave it permission. Her eyes were calm, almost too calm, the kind of stillness you saw in water just before a snake breaks the surface. He didn't say anything else, just went about boiling water and adding the grain, letting the cabin fill with the smell of something real and earthy. She sat on the cot again, not tucked like before, but perched, upright, watching. Her hands moved without sound, pulling her braid tighter, smoothing a wrinkle in her dress, and then finally resting in her lap like they had nowhere left to go. When the oats were ready, Beckett split the bowl and offered one to her. This time she took it without hesitation, but her eyes flicked to the door like she was memorizing it. "Storm's gone," he said. "But the road's worse. Mud won't hold a wagon for another day or two." She said nothing. He scraped the spoon against the edge of the bowl, forcing calm into the space between them. "You're welcome to stay till then. No one comes out here but me and the wind." Her head tilted just slightly, like maybe she didn't believe that, or maybe she did and it scared her more. He glanced at the satchel again. "You got someone you were supposed to meet?" Her spoon stopped. She looked down. Then she reached into the satchel and, for the first time, held the letters out toward him. Beckett didn't move at first. It felt like a test, like if he took them, something would shift. But she kept holding them there, and her hand didn't shake. He took the bundle gently, untied the twine, and unfolded the topmost letter. The handwriting was small, neat, and full of urgency. The kind of writing that wasn't meant to be pretty, just honest. "Dear Mr. Jameson, I am told your ranch is safe, that you're kind, that your dog doesn't bark at women, and that your porch has a red rocking chair. I will arrive on the 4th of May if the river crossing permits. Please don't mistake my silence for rudeness. I simply have none of me left to spend on words that might make someone doubt. I will come, because I must. Yours, Evelyn." Beckett felt the breath stop in his throat. He flipped to the next one. Then the next. All of them addressed to Jameson. All of them unsent. No stamps, no return. Just stacked like they were her only record of her own existence. And in each one she spoke of plans, of hope, of fear she tried to hide but couldn't. Letters written to a man she believed would meet her. Beckett swallowed hard. He knew that name. Jameson had been a neighbor, 4 miles out past the ridge. Until he went missing near the border 2 months back. Everyone assumed he got caught in the barbed politics between ranchers and the freight company or run down by rustlers. Beckett hadn't thought much of it then, but now he looked at her. Her eyes were already on him. And something in them said she knew. Not the whole truth, but enough. Enough to know this place wasn't where she was supposed to end up. "You thought I was him," he said quietly. "When you got here." She didn't nod, didn't blink. Just let the silence wrap around the truth like it didn't need explaining. Beckett tied the letters again and handed them back. She took them, tucked them away, and sat still like stone. His voice was rough when he said, "I didn't know. About him. I swear it." Still, she watched. Not judging, not forgiving, just watching. And in that silence, Beckett felt something shift. Not guilt, not yet, but a weight, a name spoken aloud, a promise that didn't belong to him but might now. Beckett rose early the next morning, boots thudding across the porch, as he checked the sky for signs of trouble, but the storm had passed clean, leaving the land soaked and quiet like it had wept all night, and now lay breathless. Inside, she was already awake, sitting near the hearth with the satchel in her lap, not reading the letters, just holding them, as if they had more heat in them than the fire could give. He didn't speak. He just filled the kettle and set it to boil, moving with the soft patience of someone who knew every sound would echo louder than it should. She hadn't run. That was the first truth he anchored to. She'd stayed, sat in the very place he left her, and in that stillness there was something close to trust, or maybe just exhaustion. Either way, it kept him gentle. "Coffee'll be ready soon," he muttered, more to the air than to her, and started slicing the last of the salted bread. The tension between them wasn't anger. It was something deeper. An ache stretched between what they didn't say and what they feared might already be true. When he handed her the mug, her fingers brushed his just a touch, but it sent a shiver through him like he'd stepped into cold water. She took it slowly, raised it to her lips, and drank. The first thing she'd accepted without hesitation. He leaned against the table, arms folded. "Your name's Evelyn?" Her eyes flicked to him, wary. But after a breath, she gave the faintest nod. "You were to marry Jameson?" Another pause. Then a second nod. Beckett exhaled and looked toward the window. "He's not coming. You know that now." She didn't respond, but her hands clutched the mug tighter, and that was answer enough. "They said he went missing in spring, just vanished. Some folks thought he skipped out on debt. Others said bandits got him. No one ever found his body." Evelyn stood. Her spine straightened, chin rising not in challenge but resolve, as if she'd spent so long curled into silence that standing tall again cost her something. She walked to the table, pulled something from her satchel, a letter with no envelope, no address, just folded like it had been read too many times. She handed it to him. Beckett unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was different, sharper. A man's. "Evelyn, you come north. You bring nothing. Not your past, not your voice, if it's broken. Just come. I don't need pretty words. I just need a woman who's brave enough to cross the plains. I got land. I got 2 hands. I got a porch that waits for no one else. I'll meet you at the Red Rock Trail Post, April 28th. No later. It was signed with only a J. Beckett looked up. "He wrote this?" She nodded once, then stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself like she was bracing for something. Beckett lowered the letter slowly. "The Red Rock Post. I was there. That week." He stopped, swallowed. "There was a fire. The freight barn caught rumors said sabotage. I remember someone yelling for help. I ran in, tried to break open the back. His voice caught like it remembered something his heart hadn't yet dared name. I pulled a man out. Burned bad. He didn't make it. Never knew his name. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't even breathe differently. But her knees gave slightly and she caught the back of the chair like the truth had punched her in the gut." Beckett stepped forward. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was him." She didn't retreat. Didn't flee. Just closed her eyes, lips parting like she might finally speak, but no sound came. Instead, she moved past him, walked to the door, and opened it wide. The wind slipped in cool and damp. She stepped outside. Beckett followed, giving her space but refusing to let the moment scatter. "You came all this way, Evelyn. What are you going to do now?" She turned toward him, hair tousled by the wind, and for the first time, something raw broke across her face. Not sorrow, not rage, just the ache of having no answer to give. Her hand went to her throat, fingers brushed her collar, then dropped. And then, with her gaze steady and quiet, she raised one finger and pointed to him. Beckett froze. "Me?" She nodded once, slow, deliberate. He shook his head. "Evelyn, I'm not the man who wrote you. I'm not the one who waited for you at the post. I'm just a rancher who happened to be there when it all went wrong." She stepped closer, reached for the letter, tapped the words, "I just need a woman who's brave enough to cross the plains." Then she looked at him again, pointed once more. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't sudden. It was something stranger. He didn't understand it yet, but it burned. Not in his chest, but somewhere deeper, where names and fate and memory started to get tangled. She wasn't choosing him. Not like that. She was deciding not to run anymore, and in him she'd seen someone who wouldn't either. The days didn't pass so much as stretch, like hide pulled taut across a frame, creaking beneath the weight of all that wasn't said. Evelyn moved like a shadow, tending to small things around the cabin, folding blankets, sweeping the porch, mending a torn saddlebag with needle and thread that must have been tucked in that satchel of hers, but never once did she break the silence. Beckett kept busy too, chopping wood with a rhythm that made the axe sing through the air, mending fences that didn't need mending, riding the southern line of the property even when he knew there was no reason to. Because staying close to her made the guilt itch behind his ribs, and still, something deeper kept his boots coming back to the door by nightfall. It wasn't pity. It wasn't penance. It was the quiet war between the man he thought he was and the one she seemed to see every time her eyes caught his and lingered just a breath too long. She didn't fear him. That was the strangest part. She didn't cower, didn't flinch. She watched, and the way she looked at him, it burned hotter than any fire he'd ever stoked. One night, after the sun had bruised the sky and slipped beneath the ridgeline, thunder cracked on the horizon. Not the kind that whispered rain, but the kind that split heavens. Beckett moved to bar the windows, but Evelyn was already there, fastening the shutters like she'd done it 1,000 times. When lightning lit her face, he saw it not fear, recognition. "You've seen worse storms than this," he said, a murmur meant for no one. She didn't nod, didn't move, just stood there in that white dress she refused to shed, its hem still stained faint red, like the memory of a wound that wouldn't wash away. He stepped closer, not touching, just near enough to let her know he wasn't scared of the silence between them. "That blood on your dress, it wasn't his, was it?" Her throat worked like the words were caught there, but still she didn't speak. She just reached into her satchel and pulled something new, something Beckett hadn't seen before. A photograph. Worn edges, black and white. A man in uniform. Young, proud, with a jaw that mirrored Beckett's so closely it made him stagger. "Your brother?" he asked. She nodded. "Army?" Another nod. Then she pulled out a ribbon folded, frayed at one end. It bore the insignia of valor. "Killed?" Her fingers tightened. One nod. Slower. He sat then, knees suddenly too heavy to carry the weight of his own questions. "I had a brother too," he said, voice low. "Silas. Rode with the scouts during the Comanche Wars. Never made it home. Came back in a pine box. They gave us a medal and half a name. Said the rest wasn't fit for printing." Evelyn's eyes didn't change, but her shoulders dropped, like some piece of her had heard that and decided not to hold itself so stiff. The storm outside roared then, lightning splitting the dark and making the cabin groan in its joints. The wind howled like something lost. Evelyn turned from the window, crossed the floor, and without hesitation knelt by the hearth. She stirred the fire until it cracked back to life, orange glow chasing away the chill. Beckett watched her. The way she moved, the way she faced every thunderclap like it couldn't break her. She didn't flinch, she endured. "You came here for safety," he said softly. "But maybe you were running from more than just a missing groom." She met his gaze. Steady, fierce. And in that moment, Beckett saw this wasn't a woman who'd been broken. This was a woman who had been bent to hell's angle and crawled back on her hands. The silence wasn't fear. It was armor. Chosen. Forged. He stood, walked to the shelf, and took down the bottle of whiskey he kept for cold nights and colder memories. He poured one glass, then another, set both by the hearth. "To brothers who didn't make it," he said, raising his. She hesitated, then lifted hers with both hands, as though honoring something far older than the room they stood in. They drank. And it burned, but it burned the right way. That night, they didn't speak, but they didn't move apart either. Beckett dozed in the rocker by the fire, rifle laid across his lap, just in case the storm brought more than rain, and Evelyn curled up near the hearth, the satchel beside her like a lifeline. Sometime past midnight, the wind died. The thunder rolled into silence. And when Beckett cracked one eye open, he saw her not asleep, but watching him, not in fear, not even in question. Just watching, like she'd chosen him to be her witness. Her storm had not passed, but maybe it had found something strong enough to hold it for a while. The morning light crept in slow, golden, and soft, touching the wooden floorboards with a reverence that didn't belong in a house built for loneliness. Beckett stirred from the rocker with a stiff groan, blinking away sleep and the ghost of a dream he couldn't remember. Evelyn was gone from the hearth, the blanket she'd slept beneath folded neatly on the bench, and the satchel her ever-present shield sat, where she'd left it the night before. He rubbed his jaw, feeling the weight of too many questions stacked behind his ribs like unspoken debts. Coffee came first, fire second. And as he worked through the quiet rituals of morning, he tried not to glance at the satchel, tried not to let his thoughts circle around that photograph, that ribbon, that stare she gave him in the dark. But when the cabin door opened and she didn't return when he stepped out to find her, not in the barn, not near the corral, not anywhere within shouting distance, the worry tightened like a rope. He called her name once, foolishly, though he knew she wouldn't answer. Then he went back inside, meaning to wait, but his eyes betrayed him. They slid toward the satchel like metal to magnet. He told himself he just needed to understand that it wasn't prying, not if it meant keeping her safe, but as his hands undid the buckle, he knew he was lying. Inside, the letters were tied in twine, yellowed at the edges like they'd been carried through dust and storm. They smelled faintly of lilac and sweat. The ink was smudged in places, the writing rushed and looping. He untied the bundle and read the first. "Dearest Thomas," it began, and his gut twisted before he even reached the second line. She had a voice all right. On paper it sang like a bell clear, strong, aching with hope. She wrote of her journey west, of the train whistle that screamed like a warning and the empty platform where he never showed. She wrote of the blood on her hem from a skinned knee she got trying to flee a man who called her property, and how she ran until the trees swallowed her. She wrote about hiding in a boxcar, of strangers who stared too long, and a preacher's wife who gave her bread and a coin without asking her name. She wrote of fear like it was a companion. And then she wrote of Beckett, not by name, but there he was, described in the shape of a cabin, the sound of boots on pine, the way he moved like he was waiting to be punished. "There is a man here," she wrote, "who carries his guilt like a badge. I do not know his crime, but I know his kindness. He leaves the axe out for me when he chops wood. He offers silence, as if it were sacred. He thinks I am broken. I am not. I am waiting. For Thomas, for the truth." Beckett's hands trembled. He read another, then another. Each one stitched from longing and confusion, love and betrayal. She never mailed them. She'd carried them like stones in her dress, building a tower of unsaid grief around herself, brick by brick. He couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop until the 10th letter, dated just days ago, when the tone shifted. "If I do not find you," she wrote, "if you are gone by choice or by death, I will still carry your name, but I will not carry your shame. I have survived too much to vanish for a man who vanished first." Beckett swallowed hard, feeling the words like lashes across the skin. And then, like a blade tucked in the folds, the final line, "I think the man who found me is the man who killed you." The letter fell from his hand like it was scalding. He backed away from the satchel as if it might strike him. Killed him? Beckett staggered to the door, chest heaving, memories flickering like sparks at the edges of a flame. He'd fought many men, killed more than he could count. But that name Thomas rattled loose something deep. A saloon in Prescott, a poker game gone sideways, a fight that spilled into the alley. A man in a gray coat with a silver watch that caught the moonlight right before the knife came out. Beckett hadn't meant to kill him. But when the blade grazed his ribs and instinct roared louder than guilt, he'd fired first. He remembered searching the body, taking nothing but the watch, tossing it into the river because it ticked too loud. He never asked the man's name. He never thought it mattered. Until now. Evelyn stood in the doorway, eyes narrowed, wind tugging at her hair like it wanted to pull her back to wherever she'd come from. She saw the letters. She saw the guilt on his face. And for the first time since arriving, she spoke. Her voice was low, ragged, yet steady as stone. "Did you kill him?" Beckett opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. The silence returned, not the safe kind, not the shared kind. This one was razor-edged, taut with betrayal. She turned, stepping back into the storm, and the door slammed shut behind her like a verdict. The wind outside screamed like a warning, tearing across the ridge and hurling dust against the windows. But Beckett didn't hear it. He stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the air thick with the ghost of her voice and the weight of her question. "Did you kill him?" Her voice had been quiet, but it cracked something in him wide open, and now there was no putting it back together with nails and whiskey. He should have chased after her. He should have said something, anything, to keep her from walking back out into that storm. But guilt held him like a vice, rooted him to the floor, and all he could do was stare at the door she'd slammed behind her like it was a grave she'd just shoveled shut. He remembered the fight now. Not just the flashes, not just the blood. The man's name hadn't mattered then. Just the blade and the cold calculation in his eyes. Beckett hadn't known who he was, just another drifter with a debt and a temper. But it hadn't been clean. That man had looked him square in the eye before falling, had gasped something like a name, maybe a prayer. Beckett had walked away, boots heavy with regret and ribs aching from the wound. He never thought that night would catch up with him in the form of a woman with a torn dress and a satchel full of unsent heartbreak. But it had, and now it was thundering through his conscience like hooves in a canyon. He shoved the door open and stepped out into the storm. Rain slashed sideways, soaking his shirt in seconds, but he didn't stop. He followed the faint trail of her footprints, half erased by the wind, headed toward the creek. Trees bent and swayed around him, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and lightning. He called her name once, then twice, but it was useless. The rain stole his voice, and besides, he knew she wouldn't answer. She hadn't come west to be found. She'd come to bury something, or someone. He found her on the far side of the creek, standing ankle-deep in water, staring into the current like it held answers. Her hair clung to her face, her dress whipped around her legs, and when he reached her, she didn't flinch. "I didn't know who he was," Beckett said, voice hoarse against the wind. "Not then. I didn't even get his name. But I remember the fight. I remember the knife. I remember the look in his eyes." Evelyn didn't move. He stepped closer, hands open like he was approaching a wild animal. Not out of fear, but respect. "It wasn't clean," he said. "Nothing about that night was. I didn't go looking for trouble, but it found me anyway, and I took a life without knowing it was tethered to yours." Her shoulders shook Onsenot from cold, but from something deeper. He couldn't tell if it was rage, or grief, or the collision of both. She turned to him slowly, and her eyes were blistering. "You took everything from me," she said, the words sharp enough to bleed. "And then you brought me here. Let me sleep under your roof. Read my words," and still said nothing. He wanted to explain that he hadn't known, that it was only the letters that had pieced it together. But what did that matter? The truth had been in his hands, and he'd still waited too long. "I didn't read them to hurt you," he said. "I read them because I needed to understand, because I needed to see you." "You wanted to feel better about it," she snapped. "You wanted to make your guilt fit inside a story you could survive." Beckett winced. "Maybe. But I also needed to know who I was looking at every morning. You came into my life like a judgment, Evelyn. And I don't know what to do with that, except stand here and own it." The storm broke above them, lightning cracking open the sky and thunder chasing it close behind. Still, neither of them moved. "He wasn't perfect," she said, softer now. "But he was mine. He wrote to me every month from that dusty outpost. Promised we'd start fresh. Promised he'd meet me when the train pulled in." Her voice caught. "Instead, I found nothing. No word, no grave, just silence." Beckett swallowed hard. "I can't give him back. I can't undo what's been done. But I can give you truth. I can carry the weight with you." "You already did," she said bitterly. "You just never looked at what it crushed." She turned away, but he caught her wrist, not rough, not possessive, just enough to let her know he wasn't done. "You want to leave, I won't stop you. But don't walk away thinking I don't care. I cared the moment you stepped off that horse with blood on your dress and steel in your eyes. Her chin trembled. "Then why didn't you say anything sooner?" "Because I thought the silence would spare you," he said. "But I see no, it only spared me." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw something shift in her gaze. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something cracked open. The storm began to ease, wind fading, rain slowing to a whisper. She stepped out of the creek and brushed past him, not quite leaving, not quite staying. And Beckett followed, each step a silent promise to never look away again. The sun had not yet risen when Evelyn stood in the clearing beyond the ridge, her boots pressed into earth, still soaked from the storm, the air sharp with the scent of pine and decay. She didn't ask Beckett to follow her, but she wasn't surprised when she turned and found him there, hands in his coat pockets, face lined by a quiet he hadn't worn before. He didn't speak, neither did she. Not until they reached the spot where the ground was disturbed and time had left its mark in crooked stones and broken twigs. "This is where it happened," he said finally, voice barely above the breath of morning wind. "I didn't bury him out of guilt. I buried him because it was the only thing left to do. I thought if I gave him rest, maybe I could find some myself." Evelyn stepped closer, her skirts brushing the undergrowth, eyes fixed on the loose soil. Her fingers trembled as she knelt, touching the earth like it might answer back. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, not looking up. Beckett's jaw tightened. "Because no one would have cared. Another dead man on the frontier, another brawl gone too far, and part of me didn't want anyone to ask if he deserved it." She nodded once, slow and quiet, but didn't reply. Her gaze was somewhere far away now, past the trees and the wind, back to the letters she'd written on borrowed scraps of hope, to the promises stitched into every line. She took a deep breath and pulled something from her Kawata letter, folded and yellowing, the last one she'd written before he vanished. She laid it on the grave. "He never saw this," she whispered. "He never knew I was still coming." Beckett stepped back, giving her space, letting her grief wrap around the clearing like fog. But then she turned, eyes sharp as glass. "You said he didn't say anything, but you looked him in the eyes. You saw the way he stood, the way he fought. Was there fear in him?" Beckett met her stare without flinching. "No, there was anger. Not reckless, not stupid, just sharp, controlled, like he had something to lose, or something he'd already lost." Evelyn swallowed hard. "He was desperate." "So was I," Beckett said. "We both thought we were fighting for something worth bleeding over. I didn't know it was the same thing." Silence stretched between them again, heavy and alive. She turned back to the grave and pressed her hand to the dirt. "His name was Isaac. You should know that. If you're going to carry this, you should know his name." Beckett nodded slowly. "Isaac." The name echoed through the trees like a bell no one had rung in years. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I won't run from this anymore. I want you to stay. Not out of guilt. Not because I owe something. Because I see you, Evelyn, and I want to help you carry what's left." Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. "You don't get to want things," she said. "Not yet." "Fair," he murmured. "But I'll be here, whether you forgive me or not." She stood, brushing dirt from her palms, and looked out at the land beyond the clearing. "There's a piece of him buried here, but there's more of him in me. I don't know what to do with that yet." "Then let me help you figure it out," Beckett said. "We can walk through it, one step at a time." She turned her head slightly, as if weighing the offer in her hands like something fragile. "I'm not promising I'll stay." "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "Only that you don't ride away before you're ready." The sun cracked over the horizon then, spilling gold across the treetops and casting long shadows over the grave. Evelyn stepped away from it slowly, her body tired but her spine straight. "I'll come back here," she said, "when I'm ready." Beckett didn't follow her as she started walking back toward the cabin. He just watched, every step she took pulling him deeper into a truth he hadn't been ready to name. This wasn't about what he'd done. It was about what he'd do now. About who he'd choose to be in the echo of her silence. And when she looked back, just once, just long enough to meet his eyes, he knew she was still listening, still deciding, still holding the door open, just a crack. The cabin was quiet that night, too quiet for sleep, too still for peace, and Evelyn sat at the edge of the hearth with her knees drawn up, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor she didn't believe in. The fire crackled low, throwing shadows against the log walls, dancing along the old cedar floorboards where dust and memory settled thick. Beckett hadn't said a word since they returned from the ridge. He'd moved around her carefully, setting out supper she hadn't touched, stoking the fire like it needed tending more than she did. But she'd felt his eyes on her, soft and uncertain, like a man standing in front of something sacred he knew he'd broken. The bundle of letters still lay on the table, her words bound together with a faded ribbon and years of unsent sorrow. She didn't know what made her rise, cross the room, and take them into her hands, but something inside her stirred, something that no longer wanted to be buried beneath silence. Beckett looked up when she stood there, framed by firelight, her expression unreadable. "They weren't meant for you," she said quietly, her voice thin but steady. "But you read them anyway." He nodded slowly, regret etched into every line of his face. "I know. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. They weren't just letters. They were pieces of you. And I wanted to understand." She looked down at the bundle, fingers trembling slightly. "You say you buried him because no one else would. But you didn't bury this. You kept it. Because it was all that was left of him," Beckett said, rising from the chair. "And because it became the only part of him I could protect, even after everything." She stared at the fire, the way its edges curled and hissed, like it too carried a secret it wanted to burn away. Slowly, she stepped forward and knelt by the hearth, untying the ribbon. One by one, she began to feed the letters to the flames. Beckett froze. "You don't have to." "I do," she whispered. "These were written to a man who never answered. A man I thought I loved, who vanished before I ever arrived. But now I know he didn't leave me. He died." The paper caught easily, curling into blackened shapes, ink running like tears until only ash remained. "These words were for him, and I'm done speaking to ghosts." Beckett moved to her side, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the heat of what she was releasing. "You're not a ghost," he said softly. "You're flesh and bone and storm and fire. And I see you, Evelyn. I see what it's cost you to survive." She turned toward him, and for the first time he saw a flicker in her eyes that wasn't pain or silence, it was choice. "What if I don't know how to begin again?" she asked. "What if all I am is what I lost?" "Then let me remind you," he said, kneeling beside her. "Not with promises, just with presence, with time. I won't ask for anything you can't give. I'll just be here." The last letter vanished into the flames, and Evelyn stared at the rising smoke like it might carry her grief into the sky. "He was the first man who ever wrote me back," she murmured. "The first one who said I mattered. He said he'd build a home, said he'd plant sunflowers near the door." Beckett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got seeds." She blinked, startled. "Sunflowers?" "Didn't plant them," he said. "I never thought anyone would be here long enough to see them grow." Her lips parted, the ghost of a breath caught between sorrow and something almost like disbelief. "Maybe it's not too late," he added. "Maybe some things still bloom even after fire." She looked down at the ash, at the burned pieces of herself, and nodded once. "Maybe." They sat there together, the fire growing low, the silence no longer heavy but sacred, a quiet that held space instead of shame. And in that flickering hush, Evelyn leaned her head gently against his shoulder, not in surrender, not in forgiveness, but in shared weight, in the small, trembling act of letting someone bear witness. Neither of them spoke again that night, but long after the fire died, Beckett placed the seed packet on the windowsill, where morning light would find it. The morning was damp with mist, the kind that clung to the skin and made every sound feel heavier, quieter, like the world was holding its breath. Beckett stood at the edge of the corral, shirt sleeves rolled, boots sunk deep in mud, watching the mare buck against the halter like it was fighting every ghost that had ever touched her. He understood that kind of wild. He respected it. But he also knew when to stand still and let it wear itself out. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, and he didn't turn because he already knew who it was. Evelyn hadn't left a single word on the pillow, but her silence felt different now. It wasn't retreat, it was reckoning. She moved softly, quietly, but not timidly. She walked up beside him, arms folded, eyes fixed on the horse that refused to be broken. "She reminds me of you," Beckett said, finally glancing her way. "Won't be touched, won't be led. But she shows up every morning, same as the sun." Evelyn didn't smile, but something flickered in her expression, a shift, a recognition, like his words had landed somewhere she wasn't ready to admit existed. She tilted her head toward the corral. "She doesn't trust you," she said, her voice low and raw, like an instrument left in the rain. Beckett froze. Not because of the truth in her words, but because it was the first time he'd heard her voice since the night she arrived. He turned slowly, eyes wide with something like reverence. "Say it again," he whispered. Evelyn's brows lifted in confusion. "What?" "Anything," Beckett said, voice cracking just enough to betray the emotion swelling in his chest. "I just want to know I didn't imagine it." Her throat tightened, and for a second she looked like she might retreat into that silence again, but she didn't. She looked at the horse instead. "She doesn't trust you," she repeated. "But she's still here. That means something." Beckett nodded, slowly, not daring to break the moment. "I've made peace with the idea that I might never earn trust, but I'd give everything I have just to be near it." Evelyn glanced sideways at him, unsure whether the words were about the mare or about her. Maybe they were about both. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the ribbon that had once held her letters. "I don't need it anymore," she said. "But I couldn't burn it." Beckett looked at the pale fabric in her hand, the only thread left from a life she no longer had. "Keep it," he said. "Tie it to the gate. Let her see it when she runs. Maybe it'll remind her that not everything needs to be torn down." Evelyn nodded once and stepped forward. The mare watched her, ears twitching, breath fogging in the morning chill. Evelyn didn't reach out. She just tied the ribbon to the post and stepped back, letting the wind carry it like a flag that didn't belong to war. Beckett watched her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as the broken bride who'd arrived in blood and silence, but as someone who might one day write her own name again, in ink, not ash. "Do you want to know the truth?" she asked, her voice still gravel, edged but growing stronger. He waited. "When I saw you that first night, I thought maybe you were him. Not Isaac, but something like him. A man who couldn't love clean, only in pieces. Someone who carried more guilt than grace." Beckett swallowed hard. "You weren't wrong." She shook her head. "I was. Because you stayed. Even when I didn't want you to. Even when I pushed every word back into my throat so you wouldn't know how badly I was drowning." Beckett turned to her fully now. "And I'll keep staying until your voice is as strong as your silence." Evelyn looked out at the field, where sunlight was finally breaking through the mist, casting long shadows and golden light on the land that had buried one man and was now trying to grow something new. "Maybe I'll speak again tomorrow," she said. "Maybe not. But today I wanted you to hear me." Beckett's chest ached with the weight of her words. "I'll never forget it." The mare stepped closer to the gate then, nostrils flaring, drawn to the fluttering ribbon and the quiet strength of the woman who'd tied it. She didn't run. She didn't fight. She just stood there, still, curious, listening. And beside her, so did Evelyn. For the first time since she'd arrived, Beckett didn't feel like he was waiting for forgiveness. He felt like he was witnessing a beginning. The wind had turned that evening, sharp and sudden, rattling the shutters and kicking dust up across the yard like it was chasing something long buried. Beckett stood at the stove, stirring the last of the rabbit stew, eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, like he could feel something coming before it showed itself. Evelyn sat at the table, her hands folded tight in her lap, gaze fixed on the fire, shoulders drawn up like she was bracing for a voice from the dark. She'd spoken twice since that morning, not more than a few words, but each one felt like a splinter of ice, cracking through the quiet they'd grown used to. The ribbon still danced on the corral post, even though the mare had retreated to the far end of the paddock. That ribbon had become something sacred now, an unspoken truce between her silence and the truth she hadn't wanted to touch. Beckett ladled stew into 2 bowls, placed one in front of her, and sat across without speaking. He'd learned better than to ask questions before she was ready. But he could feel it tonight, some kind of shift, like the air itself knew something was about to change. She didn't eat. She stared at the bowl like it held a message in its steam. Then she reached down beside her chair and slowly lifted the leather satchel she hadn't opened in days. Her fingers trembled as she set it on the table. Beckett stiffened, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He knew that bag, knew what it held. The letters, all of them, bundled together with a new ribbon. Not the faded one from before, but a dark green piece of cloth torn from the hem of her own dress. He watched as she slid them across the table to him. "I want you to read them," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, and that clarity struck him harder than any gunshot he'd taken. He swallowed. "Evelyn, you don't." "I do," she said, and there was steel in it now. Not bitterness, not accusation, just truth. And that truth left no room for retreat. Beckett picked up the first letter, hands shaking just enough to make the paper whisper. The ink was smudged in places, water warped, but still legible. He read. The first was soft, full of hope. She wrote about the journey west, about her dress, about how Isaac had promised to meet her at the bend in the river, how she dreamed of his voice in the night. Beckett's chest tightened with every line. He turned the page. The second was colder, confused. Isaac hadn't shown. She was sleeping in the loft of a kind woman's barn. She was scared but still waiting. Still believing. Letter after letter passed through his hands like ashes from a fire he'd tried to forget. And then he found it, the one that turned the tide. The 10th letter, the handwriting unsteady. The words clipped. "I asked about you," she'd written. "They said you gambled everything away. Said you were last seen with men who trade lives like pelts. One of them matched your coat." Beckett's hands froze. He stared at the line until the ink blurred. Evelyn's eyes were locked on him now, unblinking. "That coat," she said. "The one in your trunk. I saw it that first night. The blood was still there." Beckett didn't deny it. Couldn't. The room was too small for lies. "He was already gone when I found him," he said finally, voice hollow. "Outside the saloon, face down in the mud. No money, no boots, nothing. Just that coat. I didn't know his name until the marshal described him later. By then, I'd burned what was left and said nothing. Because if I had, you never would have come here." Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands curled into fists on the table. Beckett stood slowly, walking to the hearth where his rifle leaned. He picked it up, not to threaten, but to offer. "If you want me gone, you say the word, or if you want justice, you hand me to the law, but I won't lie to you. Not now, not ever." Evelyn rose too, slow and steady. She walked to him, standing close enough that the fire lit her face in gold and shadow. "You didn't kill him," she said, "but you buried the truth, and I can't forgive that tonight." Beckett nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." Her fingers brushed the letters in his hand. "But I didn't come here to punish someone. I came to find where he ended, and maybe where I begin." He looked down at her, the silence between them heavy but no longer hostile. "Then what now?" he asked. Evelyn turned toward the window, where the wind had finally settled, and stars blinked between clouds like shy witnesses. "Now we dig," she said. "We find where he's buried, and you tell me everything." Beckett set the rifle down and reached for his coat. "It's not far. I remember the tree." She nodded and followed him out into the dark, where secrets had slept too long, and truth waited in shallow earth. They walked in silence, the ground firm beneath their boots, moonlight spilling across the prairie like a path only the truth could follow. Beckett didn't look back, didn't slow, just kept moving toward the place he'd sworn never to return. A lone juniper tree bent by wind and time standing like a sentinel in the clearing beyond the ridge. Evelyn walked beside him, not behind, her wedding dress long replaced by the worn coat he'd given her, but the bloodstain on the hem still lingered like a shadow she carried by choice. The satchel was slung over her shoulder, the letters tucked back inside, not to forget, but to remember with clarity. When they reached the tree, Beckett stopped, stared at the ground near the roots where the earth had sunk slightly, not from decay, but from memory pressing down. "I dug it the morning after," he said. "Didn't know who he was. Just another drifter bleeding out in a town that chewed men up and spat them at the dirt. But I remember the way he was lying, like he wasn't surprised. Like he knew it was coming." Evelyn didn't speak. She stepped forward, knelt down, and brushed her fingers through the dry grass until they touched stone small, flat, unmarked. She looked up at him. "Why didn't you tell the marshal?" Beckett hesitated, then sat beside her, knees cracking, hands resting on his thighs like he needed them still. "Because I thought I'd seen the last of the blood. I'd spent years trying to build something clean out here. That man dying in my town, in front of my boots, it felt like a thread back to the life I left behind. I told myself if I buried it, it couldn't follow me." Evelyn's hand clenched around a rock, but she didn't throw it. She set it down gently, as if the dead still had ears. "You buried a man and the truth with him," she whispered, "and I married a ghost." The words sliced sharper than any accusation, but Beckett didn't flinch. He nodded. "I deserve that." They sat in stillness as the wind shifted again, cool and steady, rustling through the juniper's twisted branches like the tree was exhaling for the first time in years. "He wrote about you," Evelyn said suddenly, pulling out the last letter, the one she hadn't shown him. She opened it carefully, holding it like something sacred. "He said if he didn't make it, he hoped I'd find someone who'd never lie to me. Someone who didn't promise the moon, but offered a fire in winter." Beckett swallowed hard, his throat raw. "That ain't me," he said. "I've lied by silence. I let you come here thinking he left me," she finished for him, "thinking I wasn't worth waiting for." She folded the letter slowly. "And maybe I wasn't. Maybe he made peace with dying, because he knew he wasn't enough either." She turned toward the grave again. "But I came here to say goodbye, and now I finally can." She pulled a small bundle from her coat pocket, Isaac's pocket watch, cracked but still ticking faintly. She placed it on the stone and closed her eyes. Beckett didn't move. He just watched as Evelyn whispered something he couldn't hear, her lips barely moving, the lines on her face deepening with every breath. When she opened her eyes again, they were clear. Not dry, not wet, just clear, like a sky washed clean after a storm. "I'm staying," she said, standing slowly. Beckett blinked. "Staying?" "Here, on this land, in your house. If you'll have Minot as a bride with a broken past, but as a woman with both hands in the dirt, willing to build something new." His chest rose slow, like he'd been holding that breath since she first arrived. "Evelyn, don't say anything you don't mean," she interrupted softly. "Don't promise what you can't carry. Just be the fire in winter." He stood too, shoulders square, boots shifting in the soil of a grave he once hoped would be forgotten. "Then we start again," he said. "Not as strangers, not as what-ifs, but as two people who've seen too much and still stayed." She nodded, her face tired but unafraid. They walked back to the cabin together, side by side, their steps quieter than before but somehow heavier with meaning. The stars followed them home. Inside, Beckett stoked the fire, and Evelyn hung her coat by the door without looking over her shoulder. The letters stayed on the table, no longer a burden, but a map of how far she'd come. He poured coffee, and she took the mug without hesitation. No words passed between them for a long time. Then, as the wind curled around the eaves, Evelyn reached for his hand. Her touch was warm, firm, present. "This place," she said quietly, "it has ghosts, but maybe it can have grace too." Beckett looked into the flames, his fingers wrapped around hers like roots seeking ground. "Then we make room," he said, "for both." The wind howled through the cracks of the cabin like a wounded thing, clawing at the shutters and rattling the roof, but inside the fire held steady, casting amber light over the small table where Evelyn sat, hunched over a piece of paper, her hand trembling as it moved across the page. Beckett leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her with a quiet intensity he couldn't name. She hadn't written in days, not since laying Isaac to rest beneath the juniper tree, but tonight something had shifted. The storm outside echoed the one inside her, And maybe that was why she'd finally found the courage to pick up the pen again. He didn't ask what she was writing. He knew better than to interrupt a woman who'd only just begun to speak. Instead, he moved slowly across the floor, each bootstep carefully placed, not out of fear but respect, and poured her a cup of coffee from the pot warming on the stove. She didn't look up when he set it beside her, but the slightest nod let him know she'd felt his presence. The letter was short. Her handwriting, usually tight and precise, had loosened into something softer, almost hesitant, like each word was unsure of its welcome. She read it twice before folding it, sliding it into an envelope, and sealing it with the wax Beckett kept for his own rare correspondence. Then she stood, her chair scraping gently against the floor, and turned to face him. "It's to his mother," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "She never knew what happened, never got word. I owe her that much." Beckett nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll ride it into town at first light," he said. "Make sure it gets where it needs to." Evelyn studied him, eyes lingering on the small scar above his brow, the one she hadn't asked about yet, but now felt she could. "Do you ever wonder what it costs to be the one who survives?" she asked. Beckett blinked, the question catching him sideways, not because he didn't have an answer, but because it was the same one he'd asked himself every morning for years. "Every day," he said finally. "Some mornings, I carry it like a saddle. Others, it carries me." She moved toward him slowly, her bare feet quiet against the wood, until there was barely space between them. Her gaze didn't waver. "You didn't kill him, Beckett. Not really. You made a choice in a world that didn't give you many." He held her eyes a moment longer before he nodded, the weight in his chest shifting. "Not gone, but lighter." "You forgave me," he said. "Not yet," she replied, "but I'm learning how." The fire crackled, and Beckett reached past her to adjust the log, his fingers brushing her sleeve, and for the first time she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned back toward the window where the rain had begun to fall, soft and steady now, no longer angry, just tired. "I used to dream of thunder," she said. "Back home. It meant change. Meant something was breaking open so something else could grow." Beckett stepped beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "You think that's what this is?" She nodded. "A breaking. But not just mine. Yours too." He didn't argue. Couldn't. The truth of it sat too plain between them. He'd buried Isaac. She'd buried her voice. Now both had begun to dig their way back to the surface. "There's something else," Evelyn said, her voice faltering. She reached into her coat and pulled out the last letter, the one Isaac had never finished. The ink smeared at the end, where his hand must have trembled. "It says he forgives whoever did it, that he was tired, that he was running from something just as much as he was running toward me." Beckett took the letter, eyes scanning it slowly, absorbing every line as if it were written in blood. "Then maybe he found peace before he died," he said. Evelyn stepped closer, her hand on his. "And maybe we still can." The rain thickened, tapping against the windows like fingers longing to be let in. Beckett set the letter down gently, then turned to face her fully. "We'll rebuild this place come spring," he said. "Fix the fence, clear out the well, make it a home again." Evelyn's breath caught, not because of the words, but the quiet promise behind them. "And if I plant something?" she asked. "Flowers, maybe. Tomatoes. Will they take?" He smiled, not with his mouth, but with something deeper. "If the ground's ready?" She nodded once, her voice soft. "Then let's make it ready." Outside, the storm began to fade, the thunder retreating into the hills like a beast called back to sleep. And inside, two souls stood in the stillness, not healed, not whole, but willing. And that was enough. The envelope sat on the mantel for 3 days untouched. Its edges curled slightly from the heat of the fire, but the wax seal held firm like it knew the truth wasn't ready to be unwrapped. Evelyn passed it every morning when she stirred the hearth and every night when she dimmed the lanterns, her eyes flicking to it as if the paper could catch flame from a single glance. Beckett hadn't asked about it, not directly, but he watched her in the quiet spaces, those long pauses where words dried up and left only the weight of what hadn't been said. He knew what was inside. Not the exact ink or phrasing, but the feeling, the way Evelyn's hand had trembled after sealing it. The way she'd sat in the rocker afterward, arms folded across her chest like she was holding herself together with splinters. She hadn't slept well since, not really. The shadows under her eyes deepened, and once, in the middle of the night, Beckett had heard her whisper a name he didn't recognize. He thought about asking her then, in the silence of the cabin with only the wind moaning across the fields, but something in him held back, as if his own soul was waiting for hers to decide. When the fourth morning came, she stood before the envelope like it was a gravestone. Beckett watched from the porch, leaning against the post, the horizon behind him just beginning to crack with pale gold light. She picked it up slowly, turning it in her hands. "It's to me," she said without looking up. Beckett straightened. "From him?" Evelyn nodded. "He must have written it before he left. Before the gunfire. Before the trail ran red." Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers did. "He never meant for me to see it. It was buried under the lining of my travel satchel. I only found it because the stitch tore." Beckett didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. "You don't have to read it," he said gently. "Some ghosts aren't meant to speak again." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "But they already do," she whispered. "In my dreams, in the silence." She opened the letter slowly, the seal cracking like dry bones, and unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned it once, twice, and then the tears began out loud, not fierce, but soft and steady like the morning rain. She lowered herself to the rocker, letter in hand, and began to read aloud. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I never planned to leave you at that station alone. I thought I had more time." "I always think I have more time." Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together before continuing. "I lied to you. I wasn't a free man. I had debts, bad ones, dangerous ones. Men were coming for me, and I thought if I could just disappear, maybe you'd be safe. But I was wrong, Evelyn. You came anyway. And if you're here, I know you've suffered for it." Beckett's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Evelyn kept going. "There's a man in that town, Harper. They say he's dangerous. They say he's got blood on his hands. But I know him, or at least I did, years ago, before the war changed us. If anyone can protect you, it's him." She stopped reading, her eyes wide and distant like she'd fallen through time. Slowly, she looked up at Beckett, and her voice was so soft he barely caught it. "He knew you." Beckett nodded once. Slowly. "We served together. Cavalry unit. He saved my life once, in Kansas. But we parted ways when the war ended. I never knew he'd—" He stopped himself. "I didn't recognize him. Not until now." Evelyn folded the letter slowly, hands deliberate, like she was handling the last fragment of a dream. "He wanted you to protect me," she whispered. "He trusted you with what he couldn't finish." Beckett took a step forward, unsure if the floor would hold beneath the weight of what had just passed between them. "I failed him," he said, voice thick. "I took the shot. I thought God helped me. I thought he was someone else." Evelyn looked at him a long time, then stood and crossed the room, placing the letter into the flame of the hearth. It caught quickly, curling into ash, and they both watched until it was nothing but embers. "No more ghosts," she said quietly. "No more debts." Beckett reached for her hand, and this time she let him hold it. "Then what's left?" he asked. She turned to face him fully, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Us," she said, "whatever we choose to become now. Not because of the past, but in spite of it." And for the first time since she arrived, he saw her mouth curve into something close to a smile, not wide, not certain, but real, a beginning. Outside, the sun crept over the ridge, turning the field gold, and the cabin haunted, as it had been felt just a little warmer. The storm came back on the last night-low thunder, rolling over the plains like a slow, waking beast, and rain tapping on the roof with the patience of something ancient. Beckett sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, not because he needed it, but because he needed the sound, the rhythm, the control. Across the room, Evelyn paced, barefoot, wrapped in the shawl she'd arrived in, her steps soft against the worn wood, her face drawn with something deeper than worry. She kept glancing toward the door, the windows, the sky beyond them, as if she expected something or someone to appear from the dark. Beckett watched her, waiting. She'd been quiet all day. Quieter than usual, not just in her silence, but in her spirit. Something had changed since she burned the letter. Something had been released, yes, but something else had nested deeper inside. She finally stopped pacing and stood at the edge of the hearth, staring into the flame. "I lied too," she said, and the air shifted, like the storm outside had suddenly come in. Beckett looked up, his hands stilled. About what? She didn't answer right away. She crouched by the fire, poked at the logs with the iron rod, then set it down like she needed both hands free to hold what she was about to say. "I wasn't just coming here to meet him," she whispered. "I was coming to warn him, to save him if I could, because I knew they were after him, and I knew the man they'd send." Her voice cracked on the last word. Beckett stood slowly, the blade forgotten on the table. "Evelyn." She looked up, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was no barrier in her eyes. No fog of grief, no curtain of fear, just raw, burning truth. "They told me your name," she said. "In town, before I left. They said Harper would take care of it. That once you were hired, there'd be no mess, no questions. I thought if I got there in time, if I could talk to him, get him to run, or confess, or anything, they'd call it off. But I was too late." Beckett's breath left him like a gut punch. "You knew who I was." She nodded. "But I didn't expect you to be kind, or lonely, or gentle with your horses. I didn't expect you to give me space, or let me stay, or build that fence with your own hands just to keep me safe. I didn't expect to care." She stood, slowly, the firelight casting gold against her pale skin, and the silence between them stretched so long it almost became another storm. "I tried to hate you," she said, "but I couldn't. Not when I saw the way you carried your guilt. Not when I saw the way you looked at me like you were waiting for punishment. Not when I realized the man I came to warn wasn't who I thought he was." Beckett stepped forward, slow and unsure, like every motion might cause something to collapse. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to God, Evelyn, I didn't know who he was until I heard that letter. I'd been tracking a man with warrants from Texas to Wyoming. He'd changed names, disguises. I followed rumors, scars, lies. I thought I was ending a trail of blood. Not—" He stopped, his hands trembling. "Not tearing someone from your life." She stepped closer. "You didn't tear him. He tore himself. Long before you came. I just couldn't see it until now." And then she reached for his hand. Not timid, not uncertain, just deliberate. "Present, alive." He took it, held it like it was the last good thing in the world. And then, as the thunder groaned above and the fire cracked beneath them, Evelyn whispered something else. Something quiet. Something Beckett had never heard before. Her voice, clear and trembling and strong all at once. "I want to stay." Beckett blinked. "You don't have to say that. I know," she said. "But I want to. I want to build something. Here, with you. Not because I'm broken or running or scared, but because this," she squeezed his hand, "feels like the first place I've ever belonged." He pulled her close, one arm around her waist, the other steadying her back. She smelled like wood smoke and lavender, and when he kissed her forehead, her eyes fluttered shut and stayed closed like she was finally resting after a long, brutal march. Outside, the storm broke. The rain softened to a drizzle, and inside that cabin, in the glow of ash and possibility, two people who had once been strangers sat down beside the fire and began again. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.